Kia ora koutou. I'm here in front of the United Nations in Geneva, and I apologise that I can't be with you for the really important conference that you're holding in Aotearoa, New Zealand on a world without war. Unfortunately, I have to be here because we're organising some events over the next week. It's the International Day for Peace, September 21st, and the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, September 26th. So I'm involved in organising some activities here at the UN and in Geneva, and also over in New York at the United Nations. This is a really important time to have this conference. It's a pivotal time in looking where we're going into the future and whether we're moving towards a world based more on cooperative security and the rule of law, or retreating back into relying on militarism and the law of force. And with a focus on the United Nations, I think we have many opportunities to ensure that we have a much stronger adherence to the rule of law and cooperative security. And it's wonderful that this conference is looking at some of those ideas and initiatives. My experience is much more on the nuclear disarmament, so that's some of what I'll be talking about today. But it relates also to some of the other areas of cooperative security. Here in Geneva, of course, is where a number of key disarmament agreements have been negotiated. The Chemical Weapons Convention, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Of course, we also know there are difficulties here in Geneva. The Conference on Disarmament has not been able to negotiate a disarmament agreement for 19 years now. But there are new opportunities, and one that we've been discussing this week in Geneva is the idea of a UN open-ended working group to take forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations. We've seen very recently that diplomacy can work even in difficult situations with the Iran deal. We have, of course, a more complicated and nuanced situation with regards to getting to a nuclear weapons-free world. But we have an opportunity to take that forward through what it's called an open-ended working group, where the different governments can come together, talk about the different ideas, the different proposals to achieve a nuclear weapons-free world, the different legal, political and technical elements that will be required, and then try to reach some agreement. This hasn't yet been decided. It looks though there will be a resolution to the UN General Assembly this year to establish an open-ended working group, and it's something which we should be talking to our government, New Zealand, about, not only to encourage New Zealand to support, but also what might the mandate for that open-ended working group will be. And if it goes ahead, then we'll see the negotiations, deliberations and negotiations happening here in Geneva. Of course, the multilateral deliberations and negotiations are only one part of the process to get to a nuclear weapons-free world. We're going to need to encourage the nuclear weapon states to put a greater attention to their obligation for nuclear disarmament, to ensure that they participate in these negotiations and deliberations, because so far they've been quite reluctant. And in a sense, their message has been, wait until the world's a safer place. That's where another initiative is very important, and that's the initiative of the Marshall Islands. They've taken a case to the International Court of Justice against the nuclear weapon states. The International Court of Justice, of course, is one of the principal organs of the United Nations. It's not here in Geneva, it's in The Hague. But this is a very important case because it's on the disarmament obligation and what's required of the nuclear weapon states to fulfill that obligation. I think that that would run hand in hand with the open-ended working group. In a sense, the pressure at the International Court of Justice would help push the nuclear weapon states and encourage them to participate in the deliberations here. But more than that also, as I mentioned, coming up this week is the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, a very important initiative. This is the second time it's been observed, and it was decided by the United Nations General Assembly to hold this day in order to build public attention to the issue of nuclear disarmament and help generate political will. So there are many events planned around the world for the International Day for the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. I know in in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This conference is fitting in around that time. You'll have a screening of the movie, The Man Who Saved the World. We're organising a screening of the same movie here at the United Nations in Geneva. It'll also be screened in parliaments and in universities and in public theatres around the world over that week. And for those of you who don't know about The Man Who Saved the World, it's about an incident on September 26th in 1983 when we nearly had a nuclear war due to error in the command and control systems. This was in the Soviet side. Their satellites were indicating that it was an incoming ballistic missile attack from the United States. They had it confirmed by multiple satellites, and the military protocol at the command and control center was that the supreme commander of the Soviet Union should have then been woken up, told that there's an incoming attack, and then there's about 5 minutes to decide whether or not to retaliate. The commanding officer, Stanislav Petrov, did not follow military protocol. He did not wake up the supreme commander of the Soviet Union. He was right. It was a mistake. It was a false alarm. But we were lucky that we had someone who made a conscious, ethical decision not to follow the protocol. We still have nuclear weapons on high alert, ready to be fired within minutes, on launch on warning policies, and we still have that possibility of a computer error or computer hacking, or in the crisis of a conflict, misunderstanding or miscalculation. So it's important to inform public more about this, build political will, and the movie is one way of doing that. Another initiative for the International Day for the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons is a joint statement of religious leaders, parliamentarians and mayors. We already have a number of mayors, religious leaders and parliamentarians from New Zealand who have signed on to the joint statement, as have from other countries. We're still collecting those because we'll be presenting it very soon on September 26th to the United Nations. Again, as a demonstration that there is cross-party support from parliamentarians, there's support from those responsible for cities, the mayors, and there's religious leaders who are responsible for ensuring that people consider ethical and moral values in decision-making, and also to encourage the idea of cooperative security rather than threatening to annihilate the planet. So this is another contribution to the International Day, which I think will be very important. That's a couple of aspects of the United Nations working on nuclear disarmament. There are others also. The United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs plays a very positive role, and the United Nations High Representative for Disarmament in helping to support disarmament deliberations and negotiations, and helping with facilitating them, whether those deliberations are here in Geneva or whether in New York at the United Nations, to putting forward proposals and to supporting the UN Secretary General in his role. And you may know that the UN Secretary General, after support from the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs, put forward a 5-point proposal for nuclear disarmament, which has got a lot of traction and credibility. The 5 points started, the principal point was negotiations for a nuclear weapons convention. That is a treaty similar to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which would prohibit the threat or use of nuclear weapons, the possession, the production, the testing, but would also provide a phased program for the elimination of current stockpiles. So that's what the UN Secretary General has put forward in the 5-point plan. The other 4 points are like supporting initiatives for that. Regional measures like nuclear weapon-free zones. And as you know, New Zealand is already part of a regional nuclear weapon-free zone, the South Pacific Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone. Most of the Southern Hemisphere, virtually all of the Southern Hemisphere, is now covered by nuclear weapon-free zones, and a large portion now of the Northern Hemisphere as well. There are still areas where a nuclear weapon-free zone could be a very important regional confidence-building measure and disarmament measure that then can contribute to the achievement of a nuclear weapons convention. And the Secretary General's plan also talks about measures in other related areas, like in controlling all weapons of mass destruction, and also limiting conventional forces. because it's going to be very difficult to eliminate nuclear weapons if there's still arms races in conventional forces. So conventional disarmament supports nuclear disarmament. Nuclear disarmament is not conditional upon it, but it's helped by work on conventional disarmament. And it's also supported by a greater adherence to the international mechanisms for resolving conflicts without resort to the use of force, using the International Court of Justice to resolve conflicts, or using the good offices of the United Nations. New Zealand's had experience with that. And we took France to the International Court of Justice over the nuclear testing, and that was successful in moving France to stop its nuclear testing in the Pacific. We employed the good offices of the UN Secretary General to deal with the terrorist act in New Zealand, blowing up of the Rainbow Warrior. And again, it was a successful use of the mediation services of the United Nations. There are a whole range of cooperative security mechanisms in the United Nations system, and also in other treaty bodies that can be employed. One very interesting recent example is the territorial dispute between Norway and Russia. We know that the dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not going very well. Norwegians had a dispute with Russia on territory. It was the delineation of the continental shelf. That is the seabed going from their territories up north all the way up to the North Pole. Big dispute with Russia over that, but they didn't take a military approach. They didn't take a confrontation approach. They decided to take it to the Law of the Sea Tribunal. And it took a few years, but through the Law of the Sea Tribunal, there was a fact-based approach to working out where the delineation of the continental shelf should be. And they came to a decision in the Law of the Sea Tribunal, and it was something both Russia and Norway could accept, and so they've managed to work that out in a peaceful way. I think this is a key thing about the United Nations, is it provides these options of cooperative security and international legal mechanisms to deal with these conflicts. With those, there should be no need to rely on nuclear weapons. And that's one of the messages that we're giving to those states who currently rely on nuclear weapons. Not only is that dangerous and could result in a disaster, in a catastrophe, not only is it immoral to threaten annihilation of others and of innocent people and of illegal action, but it's also not necessary. There are other ways of resolving these disputes, and that's where the United Nations can play a key and very important role. The other thing I think worth mentioning is the role of the UN Security Council. And of course, New Zealand has a seat on the UN Security Council at the moment. Already, New Zealand has exhibited leadership by doing a special session of the Security Council on the security of small island states. I think that was a very important initiative. New Zealand will have another opportunity to host a dialogue at the Security Council next time it takes on the presidency again, and perhaps nuclear disarmament could be the topic that New Zealand chooses. There are a number of initiatives that they could raise at the Security Council. The working for a prohibition on the use of nuclear weapons as a step towards a nuclear weapons convention, or at least an affirmation that the targeting of populated areas with nuclear weapons is already illegal and should be totally off the books. These are a couple of ideas. The value of having a session of the Security Council is that you can raise these ideas. It might not necessarily lead to a Security Council resolution straight away, but it puts it into the process. Last thing I should mention for the International Day for the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons is that for nuclear disarmament, is we need to elevate this up the political ladder. We need this to be something that leaders of states are paying attention to. They already do this for nuclear security. We've seen the nuclear security summits, which President Obama started, and that's been very valuable in building cooperation on nuclear security aspects. But for nuclear disarmament, we really haven't had that since the Six Nations Initiative, which was very influential in the 1980s and 1990s. So that's something we should be pushing. Maybe New Zealand, along with other like-minded countries at the leadership level, could launch an initiative of leaders pushing for agreements towards a nuclear weapons-free world. And the United Nations has already decided to hold a high-level conference on nuclear disarmament in 2018. So if there was a leadership group of, say, 10 respected leaders of the world, they could help pave the way to ensure that we got decent agreements adopted at the 2018 high-level conference. So there are a few ideas, there are a few processes, a few initiatives at the United Nations. I'm very pleased that you're having this dialogue about the role of the United Nations. One can always criticize the United Nations, and we get a lot of critiques on that. We had a criticism recently from here, with a New Zealand intern here at the United Nations was camping out in a tent, saying, oh, how come we're not getting paid here in one of these most expensive places in the world? I think the key point there was that the United Nations budget is not really sufficient to do what it should be, what it's tasked to do. Its budget is about $5 billion a year. It's about the same as the budget of the New York police force. It's 1/10 of the budget of Lockheed Martin, one of the biggest weapons corporations in the world. We need to put more resources into the United Nations to enable it to do its job properly, to enable it to give some cost of living expenses to interns and to other staff, to support the work for a nuclear weapons-free world, because resources are important, leadership is important, and the United Nations is important. I wish you all the best for the deliberations. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute a little bit from over here in Geneva, and I look forward to seeing you again when I'm back home. I will be back home over Christmas, maybe see some of you then or at other times. Thank you very much and have a good conference.